What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So this week we're going to talk about the features that I think should be added to SketchUp moving forward to help keep SketchUp competitive. Stick around to the end and let me know if your top features made the list. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. I do know that people from SketchUp do read comments on some of my videos, so if there is something specific you want to see or something like that, definitely leave a comment down below. Please keep it civil because I know these things can get kind of like, I know these things can get kind of contentious, but the spirit behind this is helping improve a tool that we love, not necessarily criticizing the things that a program like SketchUp is doing. Okay, so number 10 on my list is the ability to add scene groups. So right now we can manage visibilities in SketchUp using scenes, but the problem is in a lot of cases, in order to be able to do different line weights and other things like that, we have to stack things together in layout. Well, what that can do is that can create a lot of different scenes on your top bar right here, and it can lead to a lot of scrolling across different scenes. Having the ability to group scenes, whether it be at the top of the page or if it happens over here in the scene section of your toolbar, would be extremely helpful because it would really help us manage the scenes that you have to put in a SketchUp model. I've seen models that have like 100 scenes in them, and it's just a lot of scrolling and work, and I really like the ability to group those. All right, so number 9 is a feature that I don't necessarily need, but I see a lot of requests for, and that would be the ability to turn off snapping. So being able to turn off snapping would be nice because it would give you the ability, or at least the flexibility, to draw without having things always snapping to objects in here. So sometimes you might not want to snap them to a certain point. I rarely run into this, but I see this request a lot. It would also be nice if you could leave like the directional snapping on, but turn off point snapping or turn off midpoint snapping, things like that. So programs that can do this include Blender, and Rhino as well. I know Rhino gives you the ability, and I guess Blender probably does too, to turn off different kinds of snapping. So it would be nice if you could toggle off midpoint snapping or endpoint snapping, but leave other kinds of snapping on. So the ability to toggle off snapping partially or completely would be nice in SketchUp. All right, number 8 is dark mode. So having a dark version that you can toggle to for modeling is actually extremely helpful in reducing eye strain. So many of the 3D modeling programs that I use do give you the ability to toggle to a darker mode. So Blender is a great example. Rhino is another great example. I use those as examples a lot just because I use them a lot, but having the ability to swap to a dark mode inside of SketchUp instead of a light mode, I think could reduce a lot of eye strain. It's just it's a quality of life improvement that it would be nice to see. All right, so next up is a feature that I think is long overdue and something that a lot of design professionals could actually use, and that would be improvements to the way that we can report things out of SketchUp, right? So right now, for example, we have the ability to run a report out of SketchUp, but the way that it runs is a little bit odd. So you can set it to report on a selection or the entire model, as well as reporting by things like the nesting level, like how deep things are nested inside of a model. And so you can bring things in and you can group by definition name, you can group by tag and other things like that. What I would like to see is I would like to see some additional fields that we could report out in the report right now. We've got a couple different fields, so you can see how this will create a report right here. You can also group things by picking an entity name, for example. So if we group by definition name, then it's going to come in here and it's going to group these in. But what I would like to see is I would like to see additional data slots over here for things like notes, for things like other things like that. But what I would like is I would like for things to be sortable by those advanced attributes. So instead of me having to go through and run a report based on the grouping or the component nesting level of the way things are organized inside of the model, what I would like to be able to do is I would like to be able to group or sort based on different custom selections and tags over here. So instead of having to use the model organization in order to organize my report, I'd like to be able to do that based on the data that I assign to different objects. And I'd like to be able to set up the grouping and everything else in here based on that. Now, I think there's some of that functionality in here, but I think the reporting functionality of SketchUp could definitely be improved. So I will say this is one area where looking at something like Revit might be a good idea, just because they have a lot of that advanced sorting in there. But I would really like to see improvements to the sorting and reporting in SketchUp. All right, so next up, and this is probably a pipe dream, but I do have to throw it out there. I would like to see Dynamic Components 2.0, and I'm not talking about live components. And here's why. So when you work with dynamic components right now, so let's say we bring a flex tool in order to do something like cut an opening in a wall, right? I can drop this in here, it cuts an opening in the wall, I can scale it to resize it, I can right click on it and I can make adjustments, but the biggest thing is that I can interact with it directly inside of the model. Now, when we work with live components, that's not how they work, and so they're much less effective. So for example, let's say that we bring in a live component from the 3D warehouse. So let's say live component window. All right, I'm gonna take this object, bring it in, I'm gonna drop it in the wall. So there's an option to download and configure, and we're gonna say yes. I bring this in, I click on the wall, it doesn't contain that wall cutting functionality that something like Flex Tools allows us to work with, which I mean, I guess you could make the argument that it's fine. It's not as good because Flex Tools is a tool that's actually built in order to quickly create those openings. But let's say I do have an opening in my wall like this, right? And I take that live component and I move it over here. So I can take that live component, I can move it into the opening and I can snap with it like this. But the problem is it doesn't have the functionality in here to be able to scale things so they actually fit in openings in the model. Plus, in order to configure the live component, I have to right click on it. I have to go to configure live component right here, and it has to connect to an external server in order to do the work that the previous version could do. And say that I do want to adjust the window size, right? I can adjust it, but instead of being able to just snap it in place, I have to go through and I have to measure the opening like this. So 4'4", whatever. And so we're gonna adjust the width right here. It's not as good of an experience. Now, I think there's some value and some possibilities in this Trimble Creator, Trimble Live component functionality that I think are really interesting to me. Take a look at geometry nodes in Blender, and that's kind of what I visualize. But right now, this is taking a function that we already had, and instead of improving it, it's making it more complicated. So I would love to see a real improvement of the actual dynamic components functionality, and I would love to see live components go more the direction of something like geometry nodes in Blender, where it's able to create things along paths and interface with things in the model. I think there's a place for live components in Trimble Creator, but I'm not sure this is necessarily the right application for that right now without some improvements. So I would love to see a little bit of a change in direction there. I'm not saying they should get rid of Trimble Creator, but I do think maybe it should go in kind of a different direction. So another area where I think SketchUp could really improve, and I think this could be a really good delineator for them, is improving sandbox tools. I'm going to call it Sandbox Tools 2.0. So I actually like the sandbox tool functionality. So like, for example, being able to do things like creating surfaces using from contour, I think is extremely valuable, but I think there's a lot of things that could be improved that would make this a real differentiator for SketchUp. And so, like, for example, one of the things that most people do when they're working with site work is when you work with something like from contour, for example, it just creates this triangulated geometry. Then you have to come in here and you have to like delete all of this out. It's not necessarily like optimized for things other than just bringing in like a CAD file, but people use it for a lot more than that. So there are a ton of functions that people use right now using extensions. So things like soap, skin, and bubble, for example. This is a tool that creates a grid inside of a surface, and then you can use that grid in order to create a skin. It doesn't doesn't create all this extra geometry, and it creates much cleaner topology. So another function that I think could definitely be improved is something like, instead of just having the smooth tool, which we all kind of know about, but the smooth tool is a tool for moving things up and down, having an improved functionality for doing things like improving fall off and other things like that. So again, this exists with a third-party extension, Vertex Tools, which is really great for selecting things and then setting like a soft select fall off and things like that, and visually indicating them, things like that. But this gives us the ability to move things up and down. It gives us the ability to move things sideways and scale them. It's just a better tool set. And I don't understand why tools like this aren't getting incorporated into, or improvements like this aren't being incorporated into some of the SketchUp tools. So I think we've kind of reached a point where there needs to stop being a fear of taking anything that's been an extension and making it a tool in SketchUp, because a lot of those things very naturally fit inside of SketchUp. Another thing I would say is I don't understand why sandbox tools still needs to be an extension, because as of right now, that means we don't have the ability to use it on the iPad version or the web version, even the paid version of the web version. And if we're going to have those versions out there, then there can't be the fear of adding tools, because the whole point of SketchUp to begin with was the ability to keep it simple, but then add tools with extensions. If those softwares don't have the ability to add tools with extensions, then SketchUp needs to be okay with adding new functions as native tools in SketchUp. So otherwise you're stuck in this cycle of never improving any of the tools, and I think sandbox tools has a ton of possibilities. And so one tool I wanted to highlight is Landscape from the guys at Polygon, which has just released, and it's in beta right now. I'm going to make some videos about it in the future, but this is a tool set that I think is doing that's doing terrain editing the right way. I mean, it recognizes things like paths. It has things where it adds detail just where you sculpt inside of your 3D space. It does a lot of cool things. Like I said, we're going to be talking about this in the future. It recognizes the grading along paths. It's like smart grading for SketchUp. Super excited about the tool. Like I said, it is in beta right now. I'll link to it in the notes down below. But in my opinion, this is the kind of tool that SketchUp should either be developing or talking to external developers and seeing if they can add to SketchUp, because it's actually a differentiator. And I would love to see SketchUp start adding some differentiator tools for some of these more complex functions in order to keep it competitive in the landscape moving forward. Okay, number 4 is something that to me needs to be improved in SketchUp. This is just taking one of the SketchUp native functions and taking it to the next level, is the ability to edit and adjust textures. So we need better UV mapping and material editing tools, and they exist in a way which I'm going to show you in a second. But like, for example, say that we have a surface like this one and I want to edit this material. So I do have the ability to edit materials over here. I also have the ability, if I get into the raw face, go into texture and do a position texture, I can adjust it and resize it, which is cool. It's a good function, right? The position texture function I think is a good one. The problem with the position texture function is it only works on a singular face, and it only works on ungrouped geometry. Now you can have group geometry, but you have to double click all the way in to get to a single face. So for example, say that I try to click on this surface right here, right click on it, notice how position texture doesn't show up. The reason position texture doesn't show up is because even though this is a flat surface, if I turn on my hidden geometry, I've got a softened edge in here like this. And so SketchUp sees this when I turn my hidden geometry off as a singular face, but it sees it in the same way that you can't push, pull, or curved or smooth surfaces. You also can't edit textures on there, which is very confusing. I get a lot of users that are struggling with this because they don't fully understand the way the geometry works and things like that. If SketchUp wants to be like the ultra beginner tool, then the tools like this need to be a little bit smarter so that they can recognize this. So another example right here is you've got this curved surface. So I can't right click on this and position the texture on the curved surface, because the curved surface is made up of a series of faces like this. And so without me going in and right clicking on a singular face like this, right, it's not going to work. And so the other thing is I can't position or edit the textures by right clicking on a grouped object at all. So again, that means you have to have a fundamental knowledge of the way that topology works. And if SketchUp is going to be targeting beginners, this needs to be more user-friendly. A great example of where this actually works is if you use the ThroughPaint extension from Fredo 6. And I absolutely love the ThroughPaint extension from Fredo 6 because it makes this so easy, right? I can toggle this on, right? I can select the surface, and I can reapply the texture, and I can also move it around, resize it, rotate it, and it doesn't matter if it's on a smooth surface or not. I can do the same thing with curved faces. But notice how this gives me the ability to map this on a surface in different ways, right? It's got UV mapping modes on here that I can use in order to map this in different ways. I can also move and adjust the texture live on the surface. This, in my opinion, is the way that material editing should work, and the way that the position texture tool should work is you should be able to use it on not only individual faces, but also group faces like this in order to solve UV mapping errors. And it works again with things like this box, right? If I take this box right here, and I can put it on here however I want, I can adjust the way this is mapped on the surface right here using ThroughPaint. This to me is what the SketchUp material mapping tools should look like moving forward, because it makes placing materials a lot easier. All right, number 3 to me is one of the most clunky things that we currently have inside of SketchUp, and that's that we have to create different layers and stack different viewports in order to get different line weights in layout. So for example, say that I've got a model like this one and I've got my cabinet doors right here, but then I also want dashed lines. Well, the line dashes are managed right now using the tags. And so, for example, what I have to do in order to get dashed lines in layout right now is I have to put all of my lines on a different tag and then set the dashes based on dashes over here in the visibility settings. And then once I go into layout, what I have to do is I have to stack those on a different layer than the layer that all my other stuff is on. So if I want dashed lines or I want lines with a thicker line weight, I have to create a completely different viewport and stack that on top in order to be able to make that adjustment. Then I can come over here and I can make the lines thicker and things like that. But it would make a whole lot more sense if you could just set these using the entity info. I'm not sure why we can't set line weight and dashes in the entity info, but it would be a lot cleaner than the way it's going around. I'm sure there's a technological reason for it, but this is one of those things that makes creating better plans inside a layout a little bit frustrating, especially because I do think that layout is a better tool than people give it credit for, but this makes working with it really clunky, especially for users that aren't necessarily super familiar with the program to begin with, because you start having to like stack all of these different things on top of each other in order to get this to work. All right, so number 2, and this is lumping a lot of different things into one item, is I think SketchUp needs more modeling tools. So I made a video about this a couple years ago, and my opinion on it is somewhat similar, but it's changed a little bit. And so I'm going to use one tool as an example, but I think SketchUp needs more modeling tools. So here's a great example. So right now, if I want to bevel an edge in SketchUp, there is no native bevel tool. And so what I have to do is I have to draw a line across a surface right here, and then push-pull this across in order to bevel off the edge, which is fine unless you're beveling a ton of edges or you need to do it with grouped objects. There's a lot of reasons that it would be nice to just have a dedicated bevel tool. Instead, I have to rely on a third-party extension like Bevel. And so this is an excellent tool for beveling. It does a really good job. It can do curved faces, whatever. Fredo Corner is another great tool for that. But that is a feature that I don't understand why wouldn't just be in the base version of SketchUp. Now this expands to a lot more tools than just this, and where I have an issue is with the new SketchUp infrastructure of having things like the iPad version and things like the web version. So previously, the way that we talked about SketchUp is it's a very simple modeling tool set, right, where it's basically built around being able to create a shape and extrude it to 3D. However, the caveat to that was, but it's okay because if you need to add additional tools, you can do it using extensions. And I have a ton of extensions that add functions to SketchUp that aren't in there. I'm fine with it from that standpoint if that's how we're going to add those additional tools, right? So another great example is Fredo Spline. So there's no spline editing tool in SketchUp right now, and I think that there should be, but I can use this tool, which is an extension, in order to create better curves and splines in SketchUp. It's great. I love working with it. Very cool. But the problem is now we have an iPad version and a web version that don't allow you to add extensions at all. So now you have versions of SketchUp where you can't add tools. So you have a stripped down 3D modeling tool set that you can't add tools to. Now you can make the argument that those are supposed to be lighter weight, but to me, I think it's time that we started adding modeling tools to SketchUp. So if you look at something like Rhino, for example, it has every modeling tool imaginable in there, but you can kind of toggle those toolbars on and off. You can get them out of the way if you want to. You could do the exact same thing with SketchUp. But I mean, looking at all the extensions, you have Curveloft, which does lofting. You've got Fredo Spline, which does splines. You've got Joint Push Pull, which push pulls things. You've got Instant Architecture. You've got all of these different tools available for SketchUp that make it really powerful, but they're all third party and a lot of them have an additional cost associated to it. I think it's time that SketchUp looks at adding additional modeling tools to the base functionality of SketchUp. So where I would start would be a bevel tool, the ability to push-pull curved surfaces, something like Fredo Spline, which allows you to add splines to SketchUp. I think SketchUp has the ability to be so much more with some additional modeling tools. And this is coming from someone who's worked with Rhino and worked with Blender, and I always end up back at SketchUp because I like the way that the tool set works. I like the way that modeling in SketchUp feels, but I think it could be so much better with some additional tools. So additional modeling tools are very high up on my list of things that I think SketchUp should be looking at adding moving forward. All right, so we've almost made it to the #1 feature on this list. I do have a couple honorable mention features that I think would be nice to have, but I don't think they're necessarily the highest priority. So honorable mention #1, a uniform material editing tool for the Mac version that matches the PC version, so there's not so much confusion around that, because there's a lot of PC tutorials, there's not a ton of Mac tutorials, and there's a lot of confusion with new versions. Making those the same, I think, would make a big difference. So if we want to go down the AI path, AI dimensioning and layout would be fantastic. Or adding dimensions and layout is kind of a pain. If there was something that could automatically try to find some of those dimensions and then allow me to select which ones are added and which ones aren't, I think that could be a big time saver. Live Booleans is something we've talked about before. I'm not sure it's necessarily feasible, but having the ability to do Booleans that are automatically updated as you move cutting shapes around inside of SketchUp could be extremely interesting. I'd like to see a distance multiplier added to the ambient occlusion function that allows us to multiply the distance that it's shown for larger models. It's really good for smaller models, but it seems to be based on real world sizes. Having the ability to expand that out, I think, would be a good improvement to that tool. Adding scan to design on the iPhone would be fantastic. So right now you can do scan to design on a LiDAR enabled iPad, which is great for capturing spaces. It would be really cool if you could just capture that data using an iPhone, then upload it to Trimble Connect for use in the desktop version of SketchUp as well. And then section fill textures, we've talked about before. Having the ability to add textures to your section fills instead of just colors would be a huge improvement, in my opinion, to being able to do sections in SketchUp. All right, and then the final feature, you had to know it was coming, is improvements to layout. This is the #1 request that I see on my videos. It's probably the #1 request that I see in the forum. So probably the biggest thing I see mentioned is just performance improvements. And I mean, I do agree sometimes layout can get a little bit slow, but I do think that some of the 2024 editions did make it more usable, but I'd love to see more movement in that direction. I'd also like to see some sort of a layout API, something that might allow people to create extensions for layout, make it better for themselves, as well as some additional tools and things like that. But honestly, the biggest thing I'm seeing requested right now is just improvements to performance in layout. So anyway, that's kind of my list. Again, none of this is intended to be a criticism as much as an exploration of what can make SketchUp better and take it to the next level. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Do you agree with any of these? Which ones are your top features, or is there something I missed? I just love having that conversation with you guys. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.